views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. We have a long list of items to discuss with tonight's guests. Ritchie Torres has emerged as one of the City Council's most influential figures, and so we will talk with him about legislation he's proposing regarding freedom of information, some of the investigations he's working on as chair of the Council's Investigations Committee, some Bronx and city issues, and much more. As I said, the list is long and we'll get to as much of it as we can, so please join me in welcoming the council member from the 15th Council District in the Bronx. It includes, and I'm going to list the Bronx neighborhoods, he knows them very well: Bedford Park, Fordham, Mount Hope, Bathgate, Belmont, East Tremont, West Farms, Van Nest, Allerton, Olinville, Summery, 15th District. Council Member Ritchie Torres, nice to have you with us.
Honor to be here.
So many things to get to, and I was trying to figure out how to begin.
Yes.
I thought I would launch in with the headlines of both tabloids one day last week showed Mayor de Blasio and compared him to President Trump. For someone who touts himself as a leading Democrat progressive, that's really a startling thing. And you certainly would suggest that you're a progressive. Talk to me about what that means for progressive politics. Are you concerned about the mayor's position in some of these imagery and some of these things that are out there that don't cast the right light, certainly on the mayor of the city of New York?
So there's some truth to the analogy, right? The mayor is certainly a progressive in the beliefs he holds and in the policies he enacts. But where he has something in common with Donald Trump is his approach to handling the press, right? There is a pattern of antagonism toward journalism coming from City Hall, just like there's a pattern of antagonism coming from Washington, D.C. under President Trump. We've seen assaults on the independence of the City Council, assaults on the independence of the Department of Investigations, assaults on the independence of investigative journalism from the de Blasio administration. So I do agree that there is some truth to the analogy.
Let's talk about this idea that he had suggested, or it had been suggested, that he was going to fire somebody investigating him, much like the concern that President Trump might fire, Robert Mueller. What do you make of that? Was that realistic? Do you think he was seriously considering that? And what does that mean and say about people like you who are really trying to run proper investigations to get things corrected?
So the Department of Investigations exists to investigate corruption in city government. It was the driving force behind the investigation into NYCHA's lead safety program, or the investigation into Rivington, a whole host of scandals swirling around the de Blasio administration. The mayor at one point contemplated firing the DOI commissioner. And I have a simple belief that if you're an executive, you should not be able to fire the person who investigates your administration or your appointees or you, right? Mayor de Blasio should not be able to fire the DOI commissioner for the same reason that Donald Trump should not be able to fire Robert Mueller, right? The investigators ought to be independent of the investigated, right? Investigations, to be effective, have to be undertaken without fear or favor. And the fear of retaliation from the mayor, separate and apart from the act itself, can be a threat to the investigative independence of an agency like DOI. And so I have proposed that the only way to remove the fear of retaliation is to remove the ability to retaliate. We should amend the charter to prevent the mayor from unilaterally firing the DOI commissioner without the approval of the City Council.
This, of course, is a dialogue you and I had
Yeah.
when you first got your appointment. What would be the role of the council's investigative committee as compared to the DOI?
Right.
Have you found that it's been duplicative at all, or are you finding there really is a role for me and my group to play in keeping things square?
Look, as the council's point person on investigations, I have an obligation to defend the independence of investigative institutions that keep our government honest and transparent, whether those institutions be the Department of Investigations or investigative journalists like yourself. My role as the committee chair, I oversee both the council's in-house division of oversight and investigations. So we are developing the ability to conduct our own investigations. We hired an investigative chief known as Steve Polanak. He was formerly the director of the Financial Intelligence Unit. He has experience investigating financial institutions, preparing and issuing subpoenas, so he's a bona fide investigator, and he has a budget to build an investigative team of 20 investigators, right, consisting of former prosecutors, forensic auditors to review contracts, data analysts. So in addition to our in-house division, I also oversee the Department of Investigations, which is a criminal law enforcement agency. So DOI investigates for the purpose of criminal law enforcement. It has the ability to arrest people, to conduct wiretaps. We in the City Council investigate for the purpose of gathering information that will inform our budget priorities, our legislative priorities, our land use priorities. So our investigative role is quite different from that of DOI. But I see it as my mission to defend the independence of DOI because it is the central anti-corruption agency in city government.
And, you know, in many ways, people looking for an analogy, it would be like the Senate Intelligence Committee overseeing, the various federal investigative bureaus. Many people in the Bronx, and frankly, me years ago, when they want to advocate for something and want to get information from city government, they submit a FOIL request. And I know from history, and there are some city agencies that are very good at saying the information's not available, we can't prepare it, et cetera, et cetera. You have an interesting take. Your concept is that journalists should have a first look at things, and that the law should be arranged so that journalists see freedom of information law requests first. Does that conflict with the everyday person who, frankly, is entitled to information as well?
Well, everyday person benefits from the information that journalism provides. You know, I think there's a consensus, or there should be a consensus, that journalism plays a special role in our society. It's the fourth estate. It's the fourth branch of government.
You won't get an argument from me, I can tell you that.
And one role is anti-corruption, right? Journalism keeps government honest and transparent. It informs the public about the workings of government. So between safeguarding against corruption and cultivating an informed citizenry, journalism plays a special role, and we should have priority for journalists in the FOIL process. Right? When the New York Times or the Daily News or the New York Post write an investigative article, it could be read by thousands, if not millions of people. And so by prioritizing journalists, we're facilitating the dissemination of information to the general public. We're making the public more informed about the workings of their own government.
Do you think that that would make, and I'll go back to my original statement, make it when, let's say, an advocacy group, or I don't know, the Bronx River Alliance, for example, or any one of the great not-for-profits we have in the Bronx that has a reason to investigate something, whether, using the Bronx River Alliance as an example, they want to investigate the DEP and maybe some of their pollution protection policies and what the history is. Does it put them at a loss because they're going to need a journalist to make that request to expedite it, and, well, you guys are still going to be in last place?
Not at look. The question
you don't
is,
see it like that.
Should there? No, because the advocacy organizations will continue to have the right to request information from their government. Right. What I'm suggesting is the purpose of FOIL is to provide freedom of information, free information to the general public, and how do you provide the greatest amount of free information for the greatest number of people? You do it by prioritizing journalists, because they're writing articles that are written not by one person, but by hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of people. That is how you facilitate the widest possible spread of information to the general public.
I'll tell you what, when I heard it at first, of course, my initial reaction being in media and being in Bronx media for a long time was, wow, that's a great thing. But the other thing that I do like about it is it starts to loosen the purse strings, so to speak, to say, you know what, this information is important. Let's start with journalists. You know, I'd like to think maybe one day then you'd move along and say, well, now, since we've set a time limit, you've got your system, why not make that available to some of the advocates or people that I've been talking about?
And the trouble is...
You like that idea ultimately?
I do, and the law as it is crafted has loopholes. It allows agencies to indefinitely delay the release of information. I mean, the mayor went to court for 2 years resisting the release of emails to the media. So my law says that you can delay no longer than 6 months. After 6 months, you have to provide the information. It no longer allows for indefinite delay of information to the media and by extension to the general public.
Mood in the council on this legislation? Feel pretty good about it?
I'm confident that we'll get it done. There's fierce opposition from the mayor, but the mayor is opposing greater attempts by the city council to hold them accountable.
Let's talk about a couple of other items. The Daily News did a big expose on the failure of city agencies to properly vet contractors and awarded millions of dollars to a company that has obvious ties to organized crime. What do you do? How do we clear this up? Listen, you wouldn't be the first investigator to be thinking about the problem and the mix of organized crime in city contracts.
So my office came to discover that the city of New York awarded $37 billion worth of contracts to a firm that had ties to organized crime. The original name of the company was Persico Contracting and Trucking. One of the principals was convicted of racketeering and organized crime.
So it's not just like you're making it up.
No,
he was convicted of this.
It's a matter of public record. The other principal was found to have obstructed an investigation by the Business Integrity Commission, to have lied to investigators, to have evaded unpaid debt obligations to the city. So as a result of those findings, the Business Integrity Commission stripped the company of a trade waste license. After the loss of the trade waste license, one of the principals established a new company with a different name, but the same employees, the same equipment, the same address, the same phone number, and under the new umbrella was able to obtain multi-million-dollar contracts from the city.
How is that possible? Is the city vetting process not sufficient? Do you think somebody in there was connected in some form, was paid? I don't want to make that allegation so boldly, but there's got to be a reason that something fell apart for that to have happened.
It was more incompetence than corruption. I think we identified 3 problems. Right? The first problem was that the policy procurement board rules require that the city select the lowest responsible bidder. The key word here is responsible. And the Vendex system, which is a database of all the contracts, allows the city to determine who's a responsible bidder. It's supposed to raise red flags about potentially irresponsible contractors. It turns out that the city has a habit of erasing information from the Vendex system, information about the criminal history of contractors after a period of 5 years.
5 years?
Yes.
That can't possibly be
So if you were the head of the
sufficient.
mafia 10 years, the city of New York will erase that information from its own database after 5 years. The second problem is that the city only inquires about the criminal history of a vendor over a 10-year period. So if you committed a violent crime 11 years ago, 12 years ago, we would be unaware of it because we don't even ask about it. And then the third problem is that the city does not even inquire about the criminal history of subcontractors, which is the largest universe of businesses that do work for the city.
There are a number of startling things that you said, but what strikes me as most startling is that this has never come up before. That's why I'm here. That the city has been doing business in this way. But now that we know, and I'm assuming you're going to just keep pushing forward to clean this up.
Exactly.
I mean, and let me just interject, because I've sat in this seat and watched all the projects getting built in the Bronx, from the stadium to the filtration plant to malls and everything else. And in so many cases, people say there's got to be something going on here because the wrong guy gets it. I remember even in the filtration plant, it was clear connections to organized crime, and there were federal indictments and everything else. But this is partially where it stems from, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm committed to introducing legislation that would close those loopholes. Right, we're forcing the Department of Investigations and the Mayor's Office of Contracts to think about how to reforming the system internally. But our overall finding is that the City of New York has systematically failed to collect and retain information that would allow them to determine who is truly a responsible contractor, who can be entrusted with your taxpayer dollars.
You said something in this dialogue that caught my eye. It was almost like you were looking at the next item on my list. You said it's more incompetence than corruption. I'm wondering if that leads us right into NYCHA, and we can start.
I've never heard the word incompetence and NYCHA brought up in the same sentence.
Well, at least not in the last 5 minutes, anyway. You know, I don't even know where to begin.
Yeah.
There are some things have happened. The problems are immense.
Yeah.
Even if you got the $12 or $15 billion you think you need, you're still going to have some very big issues. Yeah. Let's start with the executive order that the mayor was not happy about, that the governor issued an executive order and the city was going to have to pony up some money to pay costs. Where do we stand with that? Has the city paid? Is there still some resistance to it? Where is it at?
So first, some context. I mean, first, the Department of Investigations and the City Council came to discover that NYCHA for 4 years was failing to comply with federal and local law on lead safety, endangering the lives of every resident, particularly children, who were living in apartments that were known to have lead safety hazards. The second problem was during the cold spell. You know, NYCHA said that 97% of the residents had consistent heat and hot water. We knew that what NYCHA was reporting to the public bore no resemblance to the reality that we were experiencing on the ground, so we conducted our own investigation and came to uncover that 323,000 residents at various points in the heating season had no heat and hot water. So the loss of heat and hot water among 323,000 residents, plus the lead safety scandal, was thought to be a state of emergency, a public health crisis. And so the governor issued an executive order declaring a public health emergency in public housing. He did so in early April. And under the executive order, it requires the mayor, the speaker of the city council, and the chief resident leader in public housing to unanimously agree on an emergency manager who will then select an independent contractor to make repairs and improvements in the living conditions of public housing, including but not limited to installing boilers. Right? NYCHA originally said that it would take 5 years to install boilers in some developments. If we select someone from the private sector, we can get these boilers done better, cheaper, and faster, and do so without being weighed down by NYCHA's bureaucracy. But my concern is that the mayor and the speaker and the CCOP president appear unlikely to agree on an emergency manager. And if they fail to do so by June 1st, then the onus falls on the comptroller to select the emergency manager. You
know, just thinking politics aside, administration aside, wouldn't you think the mayor would want to do this? I mean, wouldn't he want to say, you know what, let's do whatever? I mean, obviously, this is just an immense problem that cuts to the core of so much that's wrong in our city. And so is it frustrating that the governor had to come in and step in? You think the mayor is simply being protective of his agencies? And
I think the mayor's...
You don't know, I don't know.
It seems to me the mayor's more concerned with politics than doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. But I happen to believe that good government is the best form of politics, and that there's nothing worse for you politically than to stand by idly while hundreds of thousands of residents are losing heat and hot water. And we cannot afford a repeat of the heating crisis in 2019.
There's a new ombudsman around through this consent decree, right? That we now have another layer of oversight. Yeah. Oversight is nice. Another layer, I guess, is nice. But many people would say, you know, another layer, more people. Is that what we need here? I mean, to me, you've already said what we need. We need boilers. We need somebody to get in there and scrape the mold and do all the other things that people just, you know, we got to get some workers in there and roll up our sleeves.
So you brought up something interesting. It's even worse than people think. In addition to the executive order, there is a federal investigation into the New York City Housing Authority. And it's been reported in the press that the mayor and the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District are negotiating a consent decree. And the consent decree could require the city of New York to pay hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars for improvements in NYCHA. Now, I have real concerns about the consent decree. I support greater funding for public housing, but it should be done through the budget process. It should be done on terms dictated by the mayor and the city council, not by the U.S. attorney. And keep in mind that NYCHA is legally independent of the city of New York, right? The public housing is primarily a federal program. On what basis can the U.S. attorney force the city of New York to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in improvements for public housing? Right?
So
If we do so, it should be done on our terms. It should not be done in the context of a consent decree, because that lets the federal government off the hook.
Well, that's true, but then you're caught in kind of a catch-22, is that, you're saying, well, it's their responsibility, but if they're not going to do it and they're saying you do it, and you say we don't want to do it, then you still are doing this and not getting anywhere.
I think once you sign a consent decree claiming that it's the responsibility of the city of New York, then HUD has no obligation to fund public housing. So rather than see it as a commitment that all of us share at every level of government, we're transferring responsibility from the federal government to the local government. I think that does a disservice to what's best for the city of New York.
What's the status of that consent decree? Still being negotiated?
Rumor has it that it could come out next week.
Speaking of housing, you had which we all know about over Christmas, a horrible incident of people losing their lives in Belmont, and it's hard to even talk about it. I know you were just intimately involved in working with survivors and others. But it led to something which I think is helpful.
Yeah.
Number one, awareness that if God forbid something like that happens in your home or your building, close the door.
Yeah.
And then also the dangers of children in stoves, and that we maybe need to do something else. And you and I believe the borough president took a lead on this. Talk to me about some of the new fire prevention standards that you felt were real important in light of this horrible tragedy.
Well, as you said, the fire in Belmont was the most destructive fire the city of New York has seen in nearly 3 decades. And the fire before then was also in the Bronx. So the Bronx has been no stranger to the ravages of fires. But in response to the Belmont fire, I partnered with the borough president, with Councilmember Deutsch and the speaker, to introduce a comprehensive fire safety package, which we voted into a law a few weeks ago. So one requires apartments with children under the age of 6 to have a safety knob, because we know from the Belmont fire that if there had been a safety knob on the oven, the fire would have never taken place. The second bill requires a notice in every building reminding people to close the door in the event that you're escaping a fire, because if the door had been shut, again, the fire would have never spread to the stairwell and taken the lives of 13 people. And then the third element of the package requires FDNY to partner with the Department of Education to create a curriculum specifically oriented toward toddlers. Believe it or not, toddler-initiated fires are not as uncommon as you would think, and we have to do more to educate toddlers to the extent that we can about fire safety.
What about springs on doors? And I know in my building, frankly, which is reasonably well maintained, there are stairwell doors, and some if I walk down the stairs, I close them myself. Do we have sufficient regulation? Then, of course, you need oversight to make sure it's happening.
So in addition to the 3 bills I put forward, one of my colleagues did introduce and enact legislation that requires self-closing doors.
The mayor said we're going to stop arresting people in the street who smoke pot, that it's part of a process toward the legalization of marijuana. Talk to me about your thoughts. You agree with this policy? And we know the numbers are showing that it's people of color who are getting stopped and getting arrested most often. How do you view the whole spectrum of what to do with pot in New York City?
Well, I'll share a personal experience. You know, I lived in public housing for more than 20 years of my life. And I went to NYU, New York University, for 1 year. And I will tell you, I saw more drug use at NYU than I ever saw
than all those years in public
housing. So I know from personal experience, and we know from data, that low-level drug crimes, particularly marijuana crimes, are every bit as common among white people as they are among black people, right? The low-level drug crimes are racially dispersed, but the policing of those crimes and the incarceration that results from the policing of those crimes tends to be racially concentrated. It tends to be overwhelmingly concentrated in communities of color, and therein lies my concerns, is that there's a tale of two cities when it comes to policing marijuana, and that's something we have to change.
People, and at least just trying to monitor to some degree some of the dialogue of residents of New York City. Some people agree with the mayor. Others say, you know what? I don't want to be in the park. I don't want to be walking down the street. I don't want to have my kids on their way to school and have somebody freely smoking pot in the streets. Is there a balance, or is this what we need to do?
There could be a balance, but there are several issues here. So first, there should be greater equity in policing, right? We should be policing everyone equally, regardless of race. But I would submit to you, alcohol is far more dangerous than marijuana. And if we can regulate and tax alcohol through a legal market, then why not do the same for marijuana? Alcohol is a far greater threat to public health. There's a far stronger case for prohibiting alcohol. But we know from history that prohibition tends to be not only ineffective, but counterproductive. It tends to do more harm than good.
Final question, sir. Just take a step back. Number one, for you enjoying your job? You like the job? Is this a challenge? Is this a difficult job? How do you view it when you wake up every morning and say, I'm taking on all these issues that we just talked about?
Look, I have the job of a lifetime. You know,
although it's only going for another 3 more years, no matter what you say.
But I get to be the elected official in charge of investigations in the largest city in the largest country, in the largest city in the largest country in the United States, in the world, and it's a blessing. I'm 30 years old. I'm the youngest member of the New York City Council. I am anxious about my future. I only have a little more than 3 years left.
You got to figure out what to do next after that.
So I'm governing with a sense of mortality. I'm governing as if I'm going to die tomorrow. But there's a sense of urgency that infuses the work I do, and I love every moment of it.
And you know, that, of course, raises something else we can talk about the next time you're here, and that is the whole notion of term limits. Because maybe it compels you to move faster and work harder. On the other hand, you say, if I had more time, eventually we'll do step 2, step 3 of some of these things. Anyway, Council Member Torres, always a pleasure.
For what it's worth,
you.
I support term limits.
Oh, okay. Oh, there you go.
It made it possible for me to be in elected office.
That's actually very interesting and very true. Council Member, always great to have you. We want to hear the results of all these things you're working on, and I know you'll come back and talk to the people of the Bronx.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Council Member Ritchie Torres. If you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in our borough of the Bronx, email them to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org. We will pass them along as necessary to the Council Member if you'd like. You can send a tweet at BronxTalk or post them on our Facebook page, and then we read them on the air during a future edition of our program. You can check out our archives at BronxNet.org. BronxTalk is found at the watch menu on the new BronxNet website. We thank our producer, Helen Greenberg, with Mana Heidi Soler, who filled in the studio today. Director William Guzman, thank the Council Member. Thank you. See you next week. Good night.